Today we're reading about Catherine of Sienna. This takes place in the spring of 1376 in Florence, Italy. Catherine of Sienna, do that which you have promised. The city of Florence began as a port on the Arno River. Narrow houses and docks sprang up along both banks of the waterway, with a series of wooden bridges to connect them. Wool dyers, weavers, and embroiderers produce fine textiles to export to other regions of Italy. As the port became prosperous, lavish homes and soaring cathedrals were added to the skyline. For 1,000 years, citizens crossed the famous bridges every day to buy bread, work in the dye houses, or go to church. Now the bridges were just dried up bones of the carcass that used to be Florence. A woman peered in the broken window of a shirtmaker's shop, careful not to catch her long white scarf on the glass shards. The shop was empty, except for a heavy workbench in the center. "There's not even a needle in there," she said with dismay. "Most of the other shops are empty too, or have nothing worth buying." "It's not the city I used to know, Catherine," said the man beside her. "First the Black Death, and now the war with Pope Gregory. Before the plague, the street was full of merchants at this time of day." He pointed ahead to the tower rising above the jumble of houses. "Keep walking toward the palace. That's where we were to meet them." She moved on, keeping stride with her tall friend. Both wore black cloaks. A cluster of women dressed in black with white head coverings followed them up the hill. "Why have the Florentines not made peace with the Pope?" she asked. "Surely they want an end to the war." "The Anti-Papal League has barely been able to keep mercenaries from burning down the city," he said. "They have no time to pursue lengthy peace talks in Avignon." She stopped again and turned to him with a sudden intensity. Her black eyes glowed like coals in her pale face. "Raymond, do you believe the Pope is at fault in this war?" He shook his head. "My dear Catherine, I am your confessor, not the other way around. It is not my place to question the motives of the Pope." "Still," she said, returning to her walk, "it sounds as if you're not sure which side is to blame." "I certainly blame those responsible for informing the Pope of the conditions here. If he ruled from Rome instead of Avignon, he would be much closer to what is happening in Florence." He sighed. "He has said he would restore the papacy to Rome, but so far he has not done it. If we could convince him to come see this for himself." Her voice trailed off. "I admit that I am also uneasy about these Florentine leaders." A child darted out of an alley and tugged on her robe, whining for food. She pressed what was left of her lunch into the child's hand. "Share this with your brothers and sisters," she said. He threw his skinny arms around her and dashed off with the bread. "Where are his parents?" she said to Raymond as they continued continued past the crumbling houses. "They were probably captured as slaves," he said sadly. "The Pope's interdict against the city removed all the usual protections. Anyone with a weapon can come in and take whatever he wants. Many of the citizens who survived the Black Death have been carried away as slaves." "How does that serve the Pope's purpose?" He shrugged his thin shoulders. "Gregory hopes it will force them to give up their rebellion, but I think it only makes them more angry." The brick bell tower loomed closer. "See, the red flag that says liberty." He pointed. "That is the place of the Council of Eight. It has a wonderful piazza where the people gather. Well, at least they used to gather there. And all the decisions that are made by the Council of Eight? Yes, the council members are citizens who act on behalf of the Anti-Papal League." "The Anti-Papal League?" she scowled. What an unchristian name. Your training tells you it is ungodly to reject the Pope, but your heart tells you that someone must help the people of Florence. The well of compassion in you runs deep, but only the Pope can change these conditions. Somehow we must find a way to help the government reach an agreement with him and end the war for good. He nodded vigorously. Your meeting with the Council of Eight is a good start. She hailed a group of men heading their way. That must be our welcome party, she said. He leaned closer to her and lowered his voice. If they want you to take up their cause with the Pope, force them to be honest with you. She flashed her black eyes at him. I always insist on the truth. The welcome party led the small caravan to the palace. Catherine and Raymond did not have to wait long for their appointment. They were soon shown into the meeting chamber with a crescent-shaped table and a few rows of chairs. They took the center seats and faced the council. There were more than 8 men behind the table. One of them stood. Welcome, Sister Catherine of Sienna and Brother Raymond of Capua, he began. I am Chancellor Coluccio Salutati. We are the council that runs Florence and the fight for the freedom from the Pope. He nodded. I was glad to receive your invitation. I want to do anything I can to restore Florence's unity with the Church. The council believes you can influence the Pope at the end of the war. First, I must understand your position. May I start with a question? Of course. He took his seat. What are you trying to achieve with this war? You call it a fight for freedom. The Pope calls it a rebellion. Chancellor Salutati jumped back to his feet. If overthrowing the wicked leaders imposed by the Pope is a rebellion, then I am happy to agree with him, he shouted. She blinked at his sudden outburst. Pardon the Chancellor, said one of the other council members. We don't mean to offend you. War and famine have made us bitter. Do not make excuses for your position, retorted the Chancellor. The Pope's leaders take all of our food, money, and land. They accept bribes against the innocent. They care only for their own stomachs, not the people of Italy. Catherine raised a delicate hand. Please, Chancellor, I assure you I want to hear your side of the story. There's no need to begin a debate here. He took a deep breath and sat down again. Of course, my apologies, sister. Sometimes I get a bit passionate. I think we've established that. Let me start over. The simple truth. We refuse to be governed by corrupt leaders. The Pope has tried to bully us into submitting to him by cutting us off from supplies and protection. If he does not remove his interdict against the city, the rest of our people are going to die. Raymond spoke for the first time. It may be hard to convince the Holy Father to do that, as long as you are killing his soldiers. Salutati glared at him, but stayed in his seat. Listen to me, friends, he said. Our men are being carried away into slavery, while the Pope adds towers to his palace. Our women are defending their families with the sword, while the Pope finds another chamberlain to dress him. Our children are starving, while the Pope complains that his master of the buttery brought him the wrong table knife. Catherine looked away, clasping and unclasping her hands in her lap. I, too, believe that many Christians live in more luxurious than they should, she said finally. After all, I have chosen to be a Dominican. I beg for my food. But the Pope is God's representative on earth. How can we rebel against him? If he is responsible for the deaths of our people, how can we not? Do you really believe bloodshed is the way to reform the church? He didn't answer. If I can convince him to remove the interdict, are you willing to work toward a compromise? We are willing to discuss it, he agreed. We must not go back to the unjust system of before. Then I will help you. She leaned forward. But you must let me do the talking. Pope Gregory will listen to me, but angry men with swords will not help the peace process. We will not attack unless provoked. I assure you, we only want peace and freedom for the people of Florence. She smiled. I'm glad to hear it. And I'm glad you will speak for us. The counselors heard amazing stories about you. People say you can work miracles. Don't believe everything you hear, she said, rising, but do pray for a miracle. One God can resolve the crisis in Florence. At the door, she turned back to the council. Before we go to the Pope, I would like to ask for my sisters and I to visit with the people. Perhaps we can give them a hand. He bowed. Every door in Florence is open to you. Thank you. Catherine took the women traveling with her and walked through the city, looking for people who needed their care. They gathered firewood, boiled broth, swept out houses, tended gardens, fed babies, changed bandages, and prayed with the sick. I will do everything I can to help the Pope understand your plight, she told them. Salutati appointed several ambassadors to go with them when they set out to meet the Pope in the French city of Avignon. The journey took them through the Alps. On the last night, they stopped at a quiet inn. When the proprietor saw that Dominican sisters were part of the caravan, he offered them free rooms and a hot meal. Catherine took the opportunity to write another letter to the Pope. She had written 5 times already. None of the responses were satisfying. He was willing to meet with her, he said, but he wouldn't promise to grant her request. I am sure I can convince him once we meet face to face, she thought. She sealed the letter and joined Raymond at a table in a corner of the inn. A warm fire blazed in the large fireplace on the far wall, and several other of their fellow travelers were seated in front of it. I do not trust these ambassadors, he said, glancing at the men around the fire. They have promised to follow my lead in this matter, she reminded them. He lowered his voice. How do we know they don't have another reason for coming with us? They have given me their word. What good is their word if they can't keep it? And yet, they huddle by the fire as though they are plotting. She chuckled. And here we are in the corner, whispering about them. Maybe we are the ones who shouldn't be trusted. He frowned at her. No, they are very angry about the way they feel they have been treated. I do understand that, but I don't think they are ready for peace. But who is Raymond? She said patiently. We are all sinners. By nature, we are at war with the flesh. Only Christ can bring peace. Then I pray that Christ will send his spirit of peace on ahead of us. Tomorrow we shall be in Avignon. They left early the next morning. By midday, the city was within view. Perched on a rocky hillside, the thick walls snaked down the banks of the Rhone River. Before the popes had moved the papal residence to Avignon, the houses and shops of the butchers, goldsmiths, bookbinders, and bankers made up most of the city. But for 75 years, the popes had been building additions to the papal palace. Now the pope's offices, towers, and chapels, and the guest houses took up nearly half the cramped city. Catherine's caravan was welcomed into the palace. Raymond went to the Dominican monastery. Catherine and the other sisters were given cots in the women's cloister. She did not sleep well that night. Lying on her back on the cot, she stared up at the beams in the ceiling and prayed for wisdom. The Pope isn't supposed to make mistakes, she reminded herself. But I have seen the hungry children hurt by his interdict. Our Lord said that God cares even for the sparrows. He must want the Pope to show mercy. She rolled over and tried to rest. The next morning she spoke to Pope Gregory's secretary, asking for a meeting. He said he would see what he could do, but he never sent for her. So the next morning she asked again, and the next morning. Finally, she was given a message. The Pope would see her that evening. An escort led her through the maze of carpeted corridors and into a brightly lit hall. Jewel-studded crosses hung on every wall. Pope Gregory was slouched in his golden throne, his scepter on his lap. A young chamberlain kneeled on the floor next to the throne. Behind them, like pillars against the wall, stood two armed guards at attention. When he saw her, the Pope straightened. "Come," he called. She kneeled before him. The boy quickly brushed aside the golden fringe along the hem of the Pope's robe and removed a red silk slipper, exposing a shriveled foot. She kissed it. "Welcome to Avignon, Sister Catherine," said Pope Gregory. "Your reputation precedes you." She gazed at him. He smiled, the lines around his eyes creasing into silver temples. "Successor of St. Peter, it is an honor to have your ear." He motioned to her to rise. "You are welcome in my palace." It is a splendid palace," she said. "Your hospitality is gracious." He struggled to raise himself in his throne. "I am not an old man, but you wouldn't know that by looking at me. Would you? I'm afraid my constant illnesses have aged me before my time. I pray every day for your health. Bless you." There seemed to be a good many guards around you. "Are you in danger?" Chuckling, he replied, "As long as the Florentine ambassadors are here, yes." "I beg you not to worry about them," she said. "They have promised to be proper guests in your house." He did not reply. "Speaking of your residence, may I ask how long you plan to stay in Avignon?" "What do you mean? This is where I live." "Yes, but didn't you once promise to take the papacy back to Rome?" He looked startled. Of course, all in good time, sister. But first, I must deal with the Florentines. That's why I'm here. I promised the Florentine Chancellor I would present his case to you, with your permission." He shifted. "I read your letters. They are very insightful." "Father, can't the Church help the Florentines? I have seen their desperate conditions firsthand. Your mercy toward them would go far in promoting the gospel." "Those desperate conditions are their own doing. Do you think I wanted that?" He shook his gray head. "But they continue to rebel against me and attack my army." She took a deep breath. "Do you know that the flag they fly from the palace tower says liberty on it? I have met with their council of 8. They only want freedom from tyrants." "What tyrants?" Gregory exploded. "They've been under the church's protection for years." "Tyrants that pretend to be part of this church," she replied with blazing eyes. "The leaders you appointed stole the citizens' money and seized their property, and then withheld bread from them when they began to starve." He did not reply. He looked down at her hands, wondering if she had been too bold. But then he spoke. "I could not have known about that." "My letters told you that," she thought. "And so did the Chancellor's first ambassadors who were ignored." Aloud she said, "Of course not, Father. To suggest otherwise would cast improper suspicions on your holiness." He glared at her, and again she dropped her eyes. "Now I'm aware of the problem," he said irritably. "I shall consider a solution." "What do you propose?" "They want you to remove the interdict against them and release them from the Church's control over their government," she said in a milder tone. "They will, of course, obey the Church's authority in spiritual matters." He raised an eyebrow. "Sister, you ought to know that ultimately everything is spiritual, even government. You have promoted the Crusades." "This is different." "How?" "The purpose of the Crusades is to take back from the pagans what rightfully belongs to the Church, but the Florentines are Christians who simply want peace." He was quiet. "I'm sure they will work out a compromise that will please you," she urged. "Come back in the morning," he said finally. "You will be my guest at a lovely breakfast, and then I will tell you my decision." "Thank you, Father. I will be glad to share your company again. Raymond met her on her way to the cloister. Success? He wanted to know. We shall find out tomorrow, was the reply. They were startled by a sudden shouts down the corridor. Running toward the noise, they came upon two Florentine ambassadors pinned to the floor by guards. Remove your hands, the ambassadors were shouting. We will not be treated like this. What's going on here? Raymond demanded. We caught them trying to sneak into the Pope's chambers with a dagger, explained one of the guards. Please step aside. These men are dangerous. Catherine glared at the ambassadors. Is this true? The dagger is to protect us against these goons, said one of the ambassadors. We're not threatening the Pope. We just insisted that he grant us an audience. Why? She demanded. We heard he was going to reject your peace proposal. Have you forgotten that Chancellor Salutati put this mission in my hands, not yours? The Chancellor gave us orders too. If you failed, we were to negotiate. I have only just come from my meeting with the Pope, she said sharply. I have not failed yet, and I have far better chance of succeeding than a couple of would-be assassins. She spun round and strode down the corridor as guards yanked the ambassadors to their feet. Raymond hurried after her. You were right, Raymond, she said, her face flushed. We shouldn't have trusted them. Do you really think they would have threatened the Pope's life? She stopped walking. I don't know. How will you explain this to Pope Gregory? I will tell him the truth, that the people of Florence are desperate for better leadership. Are you saying the war is the Pope's fault? Her serious face gave way to a smile. You wouldn't answer when I asked you that question. Yes, but I am your confessor. You can tell me. She shook her head. This hallway isn't a confessional. So what options do we have now? The same as before, said Catherine. Tomorrow I will beg the Pope to remove the interdict. Until then, we must double our prayers. She spent the night on her knees in the women's cloister. Dawn washed over Avignon in pink and purple strokes. Catherine left the cloister before the other women rose and walked to the palace. She needed a good stretch after her night on the cobblestones. The sun was peeking above the towers by the time she was directed to one of the palace gardens to join the Pope. A marble-topped table set with glistening pewter was nestled among the roses. Dominicans are not used to such finery, said Catherine after she had kissed the Pope's hand. The array of cold meats, fruit, and pastries was far cry from her usual day-old bread and water. Even Dominicans deserve a good breakfast once in a while, replied the Pope with a twinkle in his eyes. I did promise you a lovely breakfast. A butler offered her a pot of tea, but she waved him away. Yes, about promises, she said. Right to business, eh? Well, you at least consider peace talks with the Florentines? You mean the thugs who tried to break into my chambers last night? Your friends do not seem to share your desire for peace. She set down the roll she was nibbling. They were very wrong to do that. I have already written to the Chancellor to set him straight. But, Father, you must understand that their people are dying, and because of it, the name of Christ is mocked. Surely you are concerned about that. He stopped chewing. You are a hard person to say no to, Catherine. Then will you remove the interdict? He shook his head. It is far more complicated situation than you know. I must give it more thought, but I promise I'll send someone there very soon, to look into matters more closely. That's not a very specific promise. It's the best I can do at this time, he responded. Very well. I will gladly tell them you are willing to consider negotiations. She held his gaze. There's something else, he asked. With your permission, Father, I have another request, which surely you can perform. He gave her a benevolent smile. Anything. I mentioned it yesterday, in one of my letters. Ah, yes, he said, selecting a second pastry from the butler's tray. I assume you're talking about me returning to Rome. She pushed aside her plate, the uneaten roll in the middle, and turned intense eyes on him. Do that which you have promised, she said firmly. You must realize that a task it would be to move the entire Curia back to Rome, said Gregory. We've been here for nearly 75 years. But Rome has been the center of the church for centuries. The Curia will go where you go, and you would be much closer to Florence and other papal states, so you could keep a closer eye on the leaders who serve you there, and closer to the anti-papal league. But once you have demonstrated your desire for peace with the Florentines, they will no longer be a threat. He did not look up. You promised that you would return the papacy to Rome someday, and you are ill. How many years do you have left on this earth to do it? What will happen to the people of Florence if the next pope decides to stay here too? He set down his knife and stopped her with his hand. If I let you keep talking, what else will you request? He sighed. You're right, I can see that. I will fulfill my promise and return the papacy to Rome. Thank you. She rose. There is no need to hurry away, sister. You've hardly eaten, and after all the arguments you've made, you must certainly have worked up an appetite. The Holy Father is too gracious, she said, but I must not spoil myself, or I might be tempted to leave the Dominicans. He laughed. I admire your strength of character, sister. You are a godly woman. May God go with you. She found Raymond in a nearby chapel. What did he say? You look satisfied. She grimaced. He is not ready to remove the interdict, but he will consider peace talks with Florence. That's a start. And he promised to return the papacy to Rome. 2 successes, Catherine. You're quite a negotiator. She stared past him, going over the conversation in her head. I can only hope that once he is back in Rome, he will reach out to the people of Italy and the famine will end. Centuries ago, the first Pope, Gregory, fought for the safety of the people of Rome. He reminded her, this Gregory may yet live up to his name. I'll pray it is so. In the meantime, I want to return to Florence and do what I can to help the people. Perhaps this time you will go as the Pope's ambassador to Florence instead of the other way around. If that is the role God has for me, I will gladly fulfill it. She left him in the chapel and hurried back to the cloister to tell the sisters her news. That September, Pope Gregory sailed back to Rome with the Curia. Shortly after, he appointed Catherine as ambassador to Florence in the interests of peace. He died within a year. Catherine suffered a stroke and died on April 29th, 1380, after founding several monasteries for women and writing the Dialogue, a collection of essays on spiritual life. By the next century, Florence's prosperity had been restored, and it became a leading city of the Renaissance.